The tray slipped from Nina Alves's fingers, as if of its own accord, as if it had decided that this particular moment, this split second, where everything could still be avoided, was the perfect moment to turn her entire life into disaster. And she watched in slow motion as the bottle of wine fell, not just any wine, but Romana Conte, Izozozo, the bottle the manager had personally brought from the cellar with trembling hands and religious reverence, the bottle that cost more than Nina's car, that cost exactly $4,000 according to the label she had read 3 times, because she couldn't believe liquid and glass could be worth so much. The sound of the glass shattering against the marble floor of Vittorio's was obscenely loud in the silent restaurant. Its red wine spreading like blood, like evidence of a crime, like the end of a job and the beginning of a debt Nina could not repay. The entire restaurant froze. Forks stopped mid-sentence, conversations died mid-sentence, even the ambient music seemed to fade in volume, as if the entire universe were holding its collective breath, watching Nina ruin her own life in real time. She stood in a pool of wine worth 6 months' rent, shards of glass surrounding her cheap shoes like sharp accusations, and felt tears burn behind her eyes because she knew exactly what was coming next, knew the rules, had signed a contract when she was hired 3 months ago, stipulating that any damage or loss was the employee's responsibility, that it would be deducted from their salary, and that if the amount exceeded the monthly salary, there would be a payment agreement. $4,000. Nina earned $1,200 a month as a waitress, half of which went to rent for the tiny apartment she shared with her cousin. The rest to food and transportation and bills that never quite paid off. $4,000 was impossible, unpayable, the kind of debt that would haunt her for years, that would destroy her already precarious credit, that would turn a difficult life into an impossible nightmare. She was about to bend down, trying to pick up the pieces, as if it made any difference, as if she could put the pieces back together and reverse time, when a man's voice cut through the silence, a deep voice with a subtle Italian accent that made each word sound like velveteen on steel. "Don't move. There's glass everywhere. You'll cut yourself." Nina looked up slowly, reluctantly, and saw a man getting up from table 23, the table in the corner that was always reserved even when the restaurant was empty, the table where a man in a charcoal gray suit had been sitting alone for the last hour, drinking espresso and reviewing papers with a concentration that suggested each document was worth fortunes or lives or both. She had noticed him when he arrived because it was impossible not to notice. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without asking, who made the space around him seem more intense, more dangerous, more real than the rest of the faded reality. He was tall, probably 6 feet, with black hair graying at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than old, with a bone structure that suggested Italian or Mediterranean heritage, and eyes so dark they appeared black in the restaurant's soft lighting. He had a small scar on his left eyebrow that Nina had noticed because she'd imagined a backstory, had made up a novel about a childhood accident or a teenage fight, hadn't guessed at the scar. Probably came from much more deliberate, much more recent violence. He wore a watch that probably cost more than her car, a signet ring on his right pinky with a coat of arms Nina didn't recognize. And he moved with the quiet confidence of a predator who never doubted his own power. He reached Nina in 4 measured steps, careful not to step in the wine, and when he was close enough, she could smell expensive cologne mixed with something more masculine, more human, could see that his eyes weren't completely black, but a brown so dark the difference was irrelevant. Could feel heat emanating from him despite his perfect composure, perfectly controlled. How much, he asked, not to her but to the manager, who had appeared with an expression of barely concealed horror and furious calculations going on behind narrowed eyes. "How much is the bottle?" he repeated, when the manager hesitated, and there was a command in his voice that brooked no evasion. $4,000, Mr. Moretti, the manager said, his voice sounding both apologetic and accusatory. "It's an exceptional vintage Romanée-Conti, extremely rare, and according to the establishment's policies, Miss Alves is responsible for Alessandro Moretti." Nina knew immediately who he was the moment the manager said his name, her stomach sinking even more, because everyone in town knew that name even if they'd never seen his face. Everyone knew that Alessandro Moretti controlled half the legal and illegal businesses within 100 kilometers, that he was a man senators consulted and police officers avoided, that crossing him was the ultimate mistake many people made, and she had just destroyed a $4,000 wine 10 feet away from him. Alessandro studied Nina for a long moment, his eyes roaming her face in a way that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't, more like being cataloged, memorized, filed away in some mental database for future reference. "She's new here," he said. "Don't ask yet," he declared. 3 months, the manager confirmed. "Good performance so far, but this is unacceptable, obviously, and there will be appropriate consequences." Alessandro ignored the manager completely, his entire focus on Nina, who was beginning to tremble, not from fear exactly, but from delayed adrenaline, from the shock of having ruined her life with such a simple, stupid move. "What's your name?" Alessandro asked, his voice gentle, incongruous with his reputation. "Nina," she whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again, harder. Nina Alves, Alessandro said. And there was something almost amused in his tone now. Something that made Nina look at him in confusion, because what about the situation was funny? What about her disaster warranted amusement? "You just destroyed wine I had specially ordered. Wine I've been waiting 3 weeks to arrive. Wine I was planning to enjoy tonight because I have few indulgences, and exceptional wine is one of them." Then, technically, he smiled, and it was a small but real smile that transformed his entire face from intimidating to almost handsome. "Technically, you owe me $4,000, not the restaurant." Nina blinked, processing the words, trying to understand if this was making the situation better or worse. The manager clearly thought it was worse because he turned pale and began stammering. Something about policies and responsibilities and not wanting to offend Mr. Moretti. Alessandro raised his hand, a small but utterly authoritative gesture that silenced the manager immediately. "Nina will pay me directly," Alessandro said, "and I'll be much more reasonable about payment terms than your establishment would be." He looked at Nina again, that smile still there, small and disturbing, promising things she didn't understand. "Right, Nina? You'll pay me back. It may take time, but eventually we'll be even. One way or another." And it was the way he said those last words, one way or another. That made Nina understand with terrifying clarity that she had just made a deal with the devil. That the $4,000 debt to Alessandro Moretti would not be paid simply with money. That the price would be calculated in a currency she could not yet imagine. But that instinct screamed would be much, much more expensive than simple money. But what choice did she have when the alternative was to be crushed by debt through legal channels? When she looked at his smile and saw not cruelty, but something more complex, something that could be curiosity or interest or recognition of something in her that he saw reflected in himself. "Okay," Nina heard herself say, her voice surprisingly firm, considering she was making probably the stupidest decision in a life already marked by questionable decisions. "I'll pay you back, every penny, plus interest if necessary. Just," she hesitated, "just don't fire me, please. I need this job." Alessandro nodded to the manager. "She still has a job," he said, and it wasn't a request, it was an order. "And you're going to give me her contact details because we'll need to discuss payment terms properly." The manager nodded frantically, clearly relieved not to be dealing with the situation personally, and disappeared to get information from Nina, while Alessandro continued to watch her with that disconcerting intensity. "You should be more careful," he said, when they were momentarily alone, the restaurant slowly coming back to life around them, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Expensive wine is less of a worry than broken glass. She could have cut herself seriously. Nina looked at him, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected in the eyes of a supposedly dangerous man, genuine concern. It wasn't about wine or money or power, it was about her not getting hurt, and it was so unexpected that Nina felt something strange rise in her chest, something that could be the beginnings of gratitude or could be the dangerous recognition that Alessandro Moretti was more complicated than his reputation suggested. Human under power and danger, someone who could care even when he shouldn't. "I'll be more careful," Nina promised, and she wasn't just talking about trays. Alessandro smiled again, that small, devastating smile. And Nina knew with certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't foresee. That holding the wrong tray at the wrong time had started something that couldn't be stopped. That $4,000 in debt was the smallest price she would eventually pay for crossing paths with a man like Alessandro Moretti. But strangely, as she watched him return to his table, as he finally bent down to help clean up the mess he'd made, Nina didn't feel fear. She felt anticipation. She felt curiosity about what form payment would take, about who Alessandro really was by reputation, about whether debt could turn into something more than a financial transaction. Post here in the comments. Would you have accepted owing $4,000 to a mafia boss? Or would you have tried to run away even though you knew escape was probably impossible? Nina spent the rest of her shift in a trance, mechanically moving through her responsibilities, serving plates and filling glasses, and smiling at customers without really seeing anyone, because her mind was stuck in a loop, analyzing every word Alessandro had said, every nuance of his smile, trying to decipher whether she was in real danger, or if she had somehow just gotten incredibly lucky and encountered a criminal with a sense of humor and a penchant for mercy. Other servers whispered about the incident, looks of pity and morbid curiosity following Nina throughout the restaurant. But no one spoke to her directly, because what do you say to a colleague who just got into debt with Alessandro Moretti, who just became his property in ways that were still unclear but were obviously permanent? Alessandro stayed in the restaurant for another 2 hours after the incident, and Nina was hyper-aware of his presence, even when he wasn't looking directly at her. She could feel his eyes on her occasionally, watching her work, studying her with a level of attention that should have been uncomfortable, but was more disconcerting than terrifying. When he finally got up to leave, he stood beside her as he carried empty trays to the kitchen and said, too quietly for others to hear, "Tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Vittorio's. Let's discuss the details. Don't be late." And then he was gone, leaving a generous tip that would cover Nina's entire shift and more, and a black business card with just the name Alessandro Moretti and phone number in elegant silver letters. Nina took the card with hands that trembled only slightly, put it in her apron pocket, and continued working, because what else could she do? How else could she react to life changing from ordinary to extraordinarily complicated in a matter of hours? When her shift finally ended at midnight, she was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical. It was emotional exhaustion from processing too much in too short a time, from understanding that she had crossed an invisible line and there was no way back. The manager called her before she left, his expression serious but also curious, also calculating in a way that made Nina uncomfortable. "You're very lucky Mr. Moretti decided to be generous," the manager said, sitting behind a cluttered desk in a small office that smelled of old paper and frustrated ambition. "Most people don't get that kind of consideration. You must have impressed him somehow." Nina wanted to ask what exactly the manager knew about Alessandro, how deep the relationship between the restaurant and the man who clearly held sway here was, but instinct told her not to ask questions that might have answers she'd rather not know. "I was just lucky," she said, not believing it but having no better explanation. "It wasn't luck," the manager corrected, eyes narrowing. "Alessandro Moretti doesn't do anything out of luck or whim. If he decided to give you a chance, it's because he saw something in you that he found useful or interesting. You should be careful, Nina. Men like him don't give without eventually demanding. And the price is always higher than you initially imagine." The warning was clear, but Nina already knew it. She'd already reached the same conclusion after hours of compulsive thought about the situation. She thanked her manager for the concern, which sounded more like a warning, and rode home on a nearly empty night bus, watching the city pass by through the dirty window and thinking about how life could change so quickly, how a moment of carelessness could open doors to worlds you never knew existed, how a $4,000 debt could be both a curse and a possibility, depending on how you chose to look at it. The apartment Nina shared with her cousin Carla was quiet when she arrived, Carla already asleep because she worked the morning shift at the bakery. Nina entered the tiny room, barely large enough for a single bed and an old dresser, and lay down in the darkness without bothering to change her clothes. She just lay there processing, trying to decide whether to be afraid or fascinated or both simultaneously. Sleep didn't come easily, her mind too preoccupied with images of Alessandro's smile, the sound of his voice, the way he'd looked at her as if he were solving a complex puzzle, as if she were an interesting problem worth his time. The next day dragged on with excruciating slowness. Nina unable to focus on anything except her impending 8 o'clock meeting, trying to decide what to wear to negotiate debt with a criminal, how to behave, what expectations to have, whether to be prepared for indecent proposals or veiled threats, or something else entirely that she couldn't anticipate. Carla noticed tension during a quick breakfast and asked what was wrong, and Nina considered telling her everything, considered asking for advice or at least venting her fears, but ended up saying only that she had an important meeting with a difficult client at the restaurant, which was technically true even though it was a massive evasion of truly important details. She arrived at Vittorio's at 7:45 too early, but unable to wait any longer at home, where every minute stretched like an hour, where anxiety built until it was unbearable. The restaurant was just starting. dinner service, and the bustle was growing, and the manager saw her enter and waved to table 23. Alessandra's table, which was already occupied by him, even though it was 15 minutes before the scheduled time. As if he, too, had arrived early, as if the meeting were important enough for him to be anxious, or at least extremely punctual. Alessandra was wearing a different suit today, a navy blue so dark it looked black except when the light caught it at a certain angle, with a white shirt without a tie, the collar opened, revealing a line of throat and the beginning of chest that Nina forced herself not to stare at. He stood when he saw her, an old-fashioned gesture of chivalry that Nina hadn't expected from a criminal, and indicated the chair across from him with a graceful movement of his hand, the signet ring catching the light. "Sit down," he said, and there was a gentle command there that made Nina obey without question. "Are you hungry? We can order dinner while we talk." Business is always more productive when the stomach is full. Nina wasn't hungry, too nervous to even think about eating, but Alessandro was already signaling the waiter and ordering dishes in Italian that sounded expensive and elaborate. Psst. And then he was ordering wine different from the one that was destroyed. Obviously, but still a bottle that probably cost more than Nina earned in a week. When they were alone again, in the relative privacy of a secluded corner with soft music drowning out the conversation, Alessandro leaned forward slightly and said, "First, I want to clarify something. You're not in danger. I'm not the kind of man who hurts people by accident, especially not accidents as innocent as a slipped tray. So you can relax. This isn't an interrogation or a threat. It's simply a conversation between two people who need to reach a mutually beneficial agreement." Nina felt her shoulders. Relax just a fraction, just enough to breathe a little easier. "Okay," she said. "So, how does this work? How do I pay you $4,000 when I can barely pay rent?" Alessandro smiled, that small smile again that made something strange churn in Nina's stomach. "That's an interesting question," he said. "Cash would be the simplest way, of course. She could set up a payment plan, deducting a small amount from each paycheck until the debt was paid off. It would take years, but eventually it would be resolved." However, he paused, fingers thoughtfully tapping the base of his wine glass. "Years of small payments are tedious for both of us. So I'm proposing an alternative." Nina waited, her heart beating too fast, her mind racing with conclusions about what alternative a man like him would propose, what different currency he would accept, bracing herself for having to turn down proposals that would cross lines she wasn't willing to cross, no matter how desperate her situation. But what Alessandro said wasn't what she expected. "I need someone who speaks Italian fluently," he said. "Someone who understands not just the language, but the culture, the nuances, the subtleties that get lost in translation. I have business dealings involving Italian partners, contracts that need to be negotiated precisely, meetings where the presence of a reliable translator would be invaluable. I saw your last name, Alves. It's Portuguese, but the way you spoke to the manager yesterday, you mentioned having Italian family. Do you speak Italian?" Nina blinked in surprise. "Yes," she said, slowly. "My grandmother was Italian, from Naples. She raised me speaking both languages. I'm fluent." "Perfect," Alessandro said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Then the proposal is simple. Work for me as a translator and personal assistant. I'll pay $15 an hour, 20 hours a week to start, more if needed. That would give you more than your current salary at the restaurant, and the debt would be forgiven after 6 months of satisfactory work. You can keep your job here if you want, or leave and work for me full-time with a corresponding salary. Your choice." Nina processed the offer, looking for a trap, looking for hidden costs. "This seems," she hesitated, "too generous. Why would you do that? Why not simply hire a professional translator?" Alessandro studied her for a moment, then decided on honesty. He could hire a professional, he said. But professionals ask questions, have divided loyalties, and can be bought by competitors. You, on the other hand, owe me something. This creates a bond, an obligation that ensures discretion. And Nina, he said her name in a way that sounded too intimate, intrigued me. The way you didn't panic yesterday, the way you maintained your dignity even under pressure, the way you looked at me without the complete fear most people display. That's rare. That's valuable. So, yes, the offer is generous because I'm betting you're worth generosity. And there it was, truth in the bargain, an admission that this wasn't just about translation or debt, but about Alessandro seeing something in her that interested him, about him wanting her close for reasons that went beyond professional, even if he wasn't yet fully admitting it. Nina should say no, should acknowledge that accepting would mean entering his world in ways she couldn't control. that working for a criminal, even in a supposedly legitimate capacity, would make her an accomplice, would change her in ways she couldn't reverse. But she also looked at the life she had, at the tiny apartment and mounting debts and the future that was just more of the same, and saw opportunity, risky and dangerous, but opportunity nonetheless. "I accept," Nina said, and saw satisfaction cross Alessandro's face. Saw something that might have been relief, as if he were genuinely worried she might refuse. "Great," he said. "We'll start on Monday. I'll have my current assistant, Marco, give you all the details, the paperwork, explain expectations. And Nina," he reached across the table, fingers lightly touching the back of her hand, a touch that lasted only a second but sent electricity through her skin. "Thank you for trusting me. I know reputation comes before anything else. I know you're risking something by accepting. I'll make it worth it, I promise." The dinner that followed was surreally normal. Alessandro chatting about neutral topics, food and travel and books, revealing himself to be surprisingly cultured, funny in dry ways, attentive in ways that made Nina occasionally forget who he was, what he did, the danger he posed. When they finally parted at the restaurant entrance, Alessandro extending his hand for a formal shake that somehow felt more intimate than a casual touch. Nina walked to the bus stop, feeling as if she'd just made a deal with fate. As if Alessandro's smile and the $4,000 price tag had been a door opening to a completely different life, and she'd walked through it willingly, curious and terrified and strangely excited about what she'd find on the other side. Carla was awake when Nina arrived, waiting with a worried expression. "So," Carla said, "this meeting with a difficult client, how was it?" Nina sat, considered lying, considered keeping her cousin truly safe, but Carla was family. She deserved to know at least an edited version. "It was," Nina searched for words, "complicated. I broke expensive wine yesterday, a $4,000 wine, and the man it was for offered to let me pay for it by working for him instead of paying him outright. So, I guess I have a second job now." Carla frowned. "What kind of job? And who is this man who can afford $4,000 of wine but wants to hire a clumsy waitress as his assistant?" Nina hesitated, then said simply, "Someone powerful. Someone who can make or break me depending on how things go. But Carla," she took her cousin's hand, "I promise to be careful. I promise not to do anything stupid or dangerous. This is just an opportunity to get out of debt, maybe have a better life. Nothing more." But even as she spoke the words, even as she saw doubt in Carla's eyes, Nina knew she was lying to both of them, knew she was already beginning to feel something for Alessandro that went beyond gratitude or fear, knew that his smile and the touch of her hand and the way he looked at her as if she were a fascinating puzzle had planted the seed of something dangerous, something that could grow into emotions she shouldn't have felt for a criminal boss. For a man who lived in a world where love was vulnerability and vulnerability was a death sentence. But the seed was planted, and Nina suspected it would grow no matter how much she tried to smother it. That a $4,000 debt was the smallest price she would pay for meeting Alessandro Moretti. That the true cost would be a heart that was starting to beat faster whenever she thought of him. And that this was a price no amount of money could pay. Only time and closeness and the inevitability of two lonely people finding connection in the most unlikely place possible. Monday came too quickly, and not quickly enough simultaneously, Nina teetering between anxiety and anticipation. Between wanting to cancel everything and eager to see Alessandro again, to start a new life that promised to be anything but boring. She went to the address Marco had texted her. An elegant building in the city center that housed the offices of multiple legitimate companies, Alessandro. Controlled import and export, real estate investments, and dozens of other businesses that looked completely legal on paper, but likely had layers of illegitimacy, hidden beneath respectable facades. Marco met her in the lobby, a middle-aged man with a stern face that softened slightly when he greeted her. "Miss Alvis," he said, his Italian accent more pronounced than Alessandro's. "Welcome. Boss is in a meeting but asked me to show you the office and explain basic responsibilities. Please follow me." The office was on the top floor. A large space with masculine and sophisticated decor, dark wood and leather, and a breathtaking view of the city. Nina was led to the smaller room connected to Alessandro's main office, a space that would be hers, with a new desk and a state-of-the-art computer and a bookshelf already containing Italian, Portuguese, and English-Italian dictionaries, and numerous legal and business reference books. Marco explained that her role would primarily be to translate documents, participate in video conferences with Italian partners, occasionally travel if necessary for in-person meetings, and always maintain absolute discretion about everything she saw or heard because Alessandra's business depended on complete confidentiality. Nina signed non-disclosure agreements that made very clear legal threats about the consequences of breaking trust. And then Marco was leaving, and she was alone in a new office trying to process that this was real, that life had changed, that she was now officially employed by Alessandro Moretti, and all that entailed. Alessandro arrived at the office 30 minutes later, entering through the connecting door between his and hers without knocking. Nina stood up automatically when she saw him, instinctive respect or perhaps nervousness making her formal. He smiled, seeing her reaction. "You don't have to stand every time I enter," he said. "I'm not royalty, just your employer. Please sit down. Let's review the project together first." He pulled out a chair and sat next to her instead of maintaining a professional distance, close enough that Nina could feel his warmth, the scent of cologne she was beginning to recognize. And he opened his laptop and began explaining a contract he needed to translate, negotiations with a winery in Tuscany regarding exclusive imports. They worked for 2 hours, Alessandro patient when she asked questions, impressed when she picked up on nuances that automatic translation would miss, conversing in a mix of English and Italian that flowed naturally between them. Nina discovered she enjoyed the work, enjoyed using her brain in ways that waitressing never required, enjoyed feeling useful and competent, and enjoyed, though she shouldn't have, being around Alessandro, seeing a side of him that the media never showed, a man who was intelligent and funny and surprisingly kind when he wasn't playing the role of an intimidating criminal boss. By the 3rd week, Alessandro began bringing her to in-person meetings, introducing her as his personal translator, and Nina saw firsthand how his empire worked, how he negotiated with equal ease with both legitimate businessmen and more shadowy figures, how he changed his mask depending on the audience. Always powerful, but calibrating his power presentation in subtle and fascinating ways. She also saw how others looked at her speculation and curiosity, and sometimes envy or contempt, because everyone assumed she was more than just a translator, that she must be sleeping with his boss. Why else would he have her so close? Why else would he trust her with sensitive information? Nina tried to ignore the gossip, tried to maintain a professional relationship, but it was getting harder because Alessandro was getting more personal. Conversations drifting from work to more intimate topics. Lunches together becoming routine where they laughed and flirted in ways that denied being purely professional, casual touches becoming more frequent and lasting longer, tension building between them that was impossible to ignore. Nina knew she was falling in love, knew it was stupid and dangerous and completely inevitable. Because how can you not fall in love with a man who looks at you like you're the only person in the world who matters, who makes you laugh and challenges you intellectually and protects you in ways that make you feel precious and powerful simultaneously? And then one Friday night, working late because of a tight deadline, just the two of them in the office with the city lit up beyond the windows, Alessandro finally broke the professional barrier they'd both been dancing around for weeks. He was proofreading her translation, leaning over her desk, so close their breaths mingled. And when Nina looked up to ask her question, the words died because she saw the way he was looking at her, saw naked desire and vulnerability, and something deeper that made her heart stop completely. "Nina, Alessandro," said, his voice hoarse enough to send shivers down her spine, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to be honest with me later. These weeks working with you have been," he searched for words, "the best weeks in years. You make me laugh, you challenge me, you make me feel normal instead of the monster most people see. And I'm trying to keep my distance, trying to be professional because I know you work for me. And power dynamics are complicated, and I don't want to make you feel pressured." Or, Nina cut him off, doing the only thing she could do at that moment. The only thing that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense weeks ago, when the tray slipped and her life changed. She kissed him. She kissed Alessandro Moretti, mafia boss, her employer, a man who could destroy her with a word, but instead was frozen in surprise beneath her lips. And then she was kissing him back, her hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that belied his reputation, deepening the kiss, in ways that made Nina completely forget where she was, who he was, every logical reason why this was a bad idea. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alessandro pressed his forehead against hers and said, "This changes everything. You know that, right? We can't go back from this." "I know," Nina whispered. And I don't want to go back. I want to move forward. With you. No matter how complicated it is. Alessandro pulled her closer, a hug that was both a promise and a warning. My world is dangerous, he said. People I love become targets. You entering life personally as well as professionally means you'll have enemies you never knew existed. That you'll need constant protection, that the normalcy you once knew will disappear. Are you willing to accept that? Willing to risk it for us? Nina thought about her life before, about loneliness and struggle and a future without promises, and compared it to the weeks she'd spent with Alessandro, the way he'd made her feel alive and seen and important, and the decision was easy, even though it was scary. Yes, she said, I'm willing. 'Cause Alessandro, you made me realize I wasn't living before, just surviving, and preferring to live dangerously with you than survive safely without you. So yes, absolutely yes. And then they were kissing again, and this time there was no hesitation. Just the inevitability of two lonely people finding connection, of debt turning into something neither of them planned but both secretly desired, of a smile that cost $4,000 turning out to have bought not just services, but opened the door to an impossible love between a waitress and a criminal, between worlds that shouldn't touch but collided anyway because the universe, the weird sense of humor, and sometimes puts the right people together in the wrongest ways possible. The following months were a mix of happiness and constant danger. Nina learning to navigate Alessandro's world while falling deeper in love, as he courted her with the intensity of a man who rarely allowed feelings, but when he did, went all in, without reservation. There were threats, rivals testing whether a new girlfriend was an exploitable vulnerability. And there were moments when Nina questioned her choices, when fear almost overcame love. But Alessandro kept his promise, protected her fiercely. And gradually Nina realized that being loved by a man like him meant being defended as if she were his most precious treasure. Meant absolute loyalty and relentless protection. Meant never being alone again. And when Alessandro finally proposed, not with an expensive ring in a restaurant, but with a simple proposal in their office late at night where it all began, where their first kiss happened, Nina said yes without hesitation because she knew his smile that first night hadn't been about debt or power, but about recognition. About him seeing in her something that complemented something in him, about two broken pieces. Finding a way to fit together and create something whole and beautiful and completely unexpected, $4,000. That was the price of wine she destroyed. But the true cost, the true price she paid, was the heart she willingly gave to a dangerous man who taught her that love could exist even in dark places, that redemption was possible through connection, that sometimes accidents were fate in disguise, and that a slipping tray and spilled wine and a powerful man's smile could conspire to change lives completely in ways no amount of planning could, ways that were frightening and perfect and utterly inevitable, from the moment their eyes met over a pool of Romanacconti, worth a fortune, but costing far less than the future they built together on a foundation of forgiven debt and a love no one expected, but everyone deserved.